Let's continue with the discussion of all the challenges we are facing in sustaining the commons. Uh, you can either see it as a failure of humanity in solving problems, or you can see it as always learning because new problems keep arising. Climate change is a new problem. Humanity faced climate change before because there were ice ages and droughts and floods and sea level changes and so on in the past related to natural forcing, and they did adapt by moving you know crossing across continents and occupying most of the world, adjusting to cold temperatures, going to seafood when there was a crisis on land, and so on and so forth. So it's not like we haven't solved problems, it's just that we're always two steps behind and not always staying ahead of the problems. For example, we created the climate change problem and we kept burning fossil fuels, we in the sense the industrialized Western world, even though there was clear evidence that the burning coal was not good and then burning fossil fuels, gas, oil was not good. We kept going till the situation became quite serious. Then we said, oops, this is not good, let's negotiate and try to solve the problem. So that's where sustaining the commons comes in. Collective action, right? The rules in use are one of the key foci of the institutional analysis and development framework. Rules on paper are important, but if those rules are not known, understood, and accepted by participants in the action situation, they will not effectively guide behavior. In studying the governance of the commons, we are interested in which rules people actually use, how they monitor rule compliance, sanction rule infractions, and how contextual variables impact how the rules function. So you always have laws and a legal system, so rules cannot blindly be applied in every situation. We have discussed this already in chapter 2 when we looked at this institutional analysis framework before as well. As we said, in a soccer game, a lot of infractions may happen, but the referee will not keep giving a yellow card every time, but there is a threshold which often is very subjective, and if the player crosses that threshold of that referee, then the player may be pulled up and given a yellow card, and if another infraction happens you may move to a red card. And this is the same thing about exceeding speed limits and so on and so forth. I'm in a situation here in the institute I'm working at where the housing rules are being applied to me, and exception could be made, but the person in charge is refusing to make an exception because he says rules are rules and must be applied no matter what. So these are common problems for humanity. It's important to understand that IID framework is not a theory. It does not suggest a hypothesis about how different parts of action situations relate to outcomes. There is no typology of every component, every situation interacting and feeding back the same way. Theory relevant to understanding social phenomena is an additional layer related to how people make decisions in different action situations. So social dilemma kind of experiments try to extract behavioral aspects, and then behavioral economists try to use those to understand people as well as marketing and other entities try to sell you things from the data they gathered, sometimes at your own individual level, to say what your tendencies are, and if they flash a subtle signal to you about a particular product, how likely are you to check it out and maybe even buy it, and so on. So those come out of larger behavioral issues, not necessarily in the collective action, but it adds up to collective action as well. We discussed one theory of human decision making called rational choice theory. When we then discussed experimental work that shows that this theory of behavior holds only in certain circumstances. That one is based on rational egoist model of a human being. Given all the information, do human beings always try to do things that maximize their self-interest? Turns out that that's not always the situation. Circumstantially, contextually, it can be. Human decisions take more into account than narrow self-interest, which is a good thing. We illustrated the importance of this fact through social dilemma experiments, right? go back and read those if necessary. So skipping some text, I'm reading a lot of text because this chapter is just mostly discussing these ideas, which I want to make sure I don't miss if I try to paraphrase them instead of just reading them. But I've selected the key paragraphs to read according to my own subjective choice again, but the book is very easy to read, so you should follow up. Both of these economic instruments, so privatization and taxation, are used in managing the commons in practice. So obviously I skipped some text. Solving commons issues, as we discussed about rules and norms and punishments, you can assume if the public goods are not serving well, let's say water supply, maintenance of roads we discussed before, you can collect tolls. Private company can be in charge of collecting tolls and keeping the roads updated and safe and clean and so on. Or you can add a taxation. So toll is a taxation and privatization together when a private company owns the road. But we'll see an example of how penalizing people can work in some contexts but not in other contexts, right? So the idea is how to make common goods be equitably accessible to all and sustained, so that we can have triumph of the commons, whether it's groundwater or air or something else, or how to maintain public goods through privatization and maybe taxation as well. So these are used in managing the commons in practice. However, these instruments face several practical limitations, are not the only options available. There are many examples of self-governance, meaning that the users and producers of the commons are crafting, implementing and maintaining the institutional arrangements themselves. Based on these institutional arrangements, communities can successfully govern the commons without privatization or taxation from an outside governmental body. What is the problem then? The problem is that this can only work at a certain scale. Few farmers managing an irrigation system, or few people sharing a common land, or a sports arena being maintained, a cooperative sports league being maintained by people with internal organization and so on. It fails at a certain scale. That's the main point. The challenge that the tools developed in this book are meant to address is to understand what kind of institutional arrangements are successful in which circumstances. So there are basic design principles on managing the commons collective action problems, but there are always circumstances in which you may want to develop modified versions of this framework. A coercive approach is not necessarily a productive approach. Coercion may demotivate participants. Providing monetary incentives may also not always be beneficial. An illustrative example is the study by Gnisi and Rusticini on daycare centers. Parents often come late to collect their kids from daycare. Parents are running around, they may be stuck in traffic, or they may just be not able to time themselves properly. To reduce the number of people who are late, an experiment was performed that imposed a monetary penalty when parents were late. Surprisingly, parents came late more often. Just because you imposed a penalty for coming late, people didn't say, okay, I'll go on time and not pay the penalty. Instead, they started saying, I'll just pay the penalty and take my time. Why should anyone complain when they have paid for it? So it became an idea that I'll come late, but I pay the penalty, so you cannot complain. And other people said, if they're paying the penalty, then we don't care. Parents who were willing to pay the price could come late without feeling guilty. When daycare centers wanted to revert back to the original situation and remove the penalty, the number of parents who came late remained high. So they just got used to the idea of coming late. Of course, it has lots of other consequences on the daycare providers. They have to stay back. They have to take care of the kids beyond their working hours. Even if you pay penalty and pay X over time, they themselves may not be able to stay for that little extra money and so on. A behavior that is a moral obligation, which is coming on time to collect your child, in fact became an economic transaction where you just pay the fee. This is a risk of using economic incentives to stimulate behavioral change. It may have unintended, difficult to reverse consequences. Who is paying the price here ultimately? The children, who need to be picked up on time and taken back home and given the rest or whatever. They are becoming a pawn in this game of parents not having time or not being able to stick to time and their moral obligation, and the children pay the price for that, right? The study of successful institutional arrangements shows that it is important that participants in action situations are involved in the creation of rules, that there are low-cost conflict resolution mechanisms, and that there are clear rules about who and when people can use the commons. So that's not written very well. Who and when can is that the right way to see it? Who and when people can use the commons. Okay, whatever. It's not exactly the way to say it. Who can use it and when can they use it is, I don't know, whatever. So we talked in many situations, even in the adaptation course, about the importance of stakeholder engagement, and even in disaster management, when women are included in designing the rules and methodologies and action plans and early warnings, responses on the part of the people affected, things get much better. So that's known again and again, and yet it's not always very intuitive to include stakeholders in the creation of rules. Effective institutional mechanisms stimulate personal interactions that facilitate trust relationships and allow participants to build reputations. When people on eBay provide feedback based on their experience in the transaction they just finished, it contributes to information about the reputation of their economic partners. When people edit the English text of Wikipedia articles, they gain respect and a good reputation in the community that may enable them to occupy a special role in the community. Okay, so it's a kind of a contribution you are making at a cost to yourself. We talked about this before, and yet you are doing something and you get tributary power. You like to have a good reputation, which gives you some sense of power, and there may be ways to cash on this power in some circumstances. When a tennis player who just lost a match shakes the hand of the opponent, it reinforces the respectful relationship they have with each other, so the next time they play each other there will be a mutual respect in addition to the competition and the killer instinct. The emerging picture of effective institutional arrangements is that in order to have success, it's important that people can develop trusted relationships, gain a reputation, experiment with new arrangements, tolerate mistakes people make, and have commonly understood rules in use. Most of these insights have been derived from studies of communities which share common pool resources. If we know so much about the successes, then why are there still so many problems in managing the commons? Right? So reputation always matters. Even in a class I'm teaching, if a student is very regular and attends classes every time, and if the student is missing, I know there must be a real issue. But if the student is very poor in attendance, then even when I ask the student why, and the student says he or she was sick or grandma died or whatever, then credibility is low because you miss too many classes, and grandma cannot die so many times, or even you cannot get sick so many times unless there is some real issue. So reputation of what kind of a person you are in an action situation does help when you make a mistake or when you are unable to perform your moral duty and so on. Okay, so we'll come back and look at why there are still so many problems in governance of the commons, which is what ultimately we want to accomplish in real life in every action situation, but also especially for the climate change problem. Okay.